In this movie, I'll show you how to use the dodge and burn tools, which allow you to paint in brightness and darkness respectively. Except for this contouring over here in the right-hand cheek. We've got two areas that I don't like. One is this little bit of brightness right there in the center that makes it look like we have a lump or a divot or something. And then we've got this little bit of darkness on the right-hand side that makes the cheek look like it has uneven contouring. So I'm going to deselect the image there just by clicking. And the dodge tool is by default the last tool in this second group of tools. And notice that it has a keyboard shortcut of O. If you don't see the dodge tool, click and hold on the tool and select the first tool from the flyout menu. And then I'll increase the size of my brush by pressing the right bracket key. Also right click inside the image window so that you can see by default the hardness is set to 0%, which is exactly what we want. We want a nice soft brush. So I'll press the enter key to hide that pop-up panel, and then I'll just paint inside this region like so. And that gives me too much brightness. And that's because the exposure by default is set to 50%, which is generally too high. So I'll press Ctrl-Z or Command-Z on the Mac to undo that change. And then I'll press the 2 key to reduce the exposure value to 20%. And now I'll paint again, which ends up giving me a better result. And now I'll paint in another brush stroke right about there. I think I've gone too far, in which case you can fade the brush stroke by pressing Ctrl-Shift-F or Command-Shift-F on the Mac to bring up the fade dialog box. And then I'll try reducing that opacity to 50%. Looks good, so I'll click OK. Now let's address the regions that are too bright. I'll go ahead and click and hold on the dodge tool and choose the burn tool from the flyout menu. And the way I remember the difference between these tools is burning makes things darker. For example, if you burn toast, it's going to be very dark. Whereas dodging is the other tool, so it makes things bright. Anyway, I'm going to switch to the burn tool. Again, it has an awfully high exposure value, 50% by default. So I'm going to press the 2 key to reduce that value to 20%. I'll increase the size of my cursor a little bit, again by pressing the right bracket key, and I'll click right about there. And that maybe goes too far, so I'll press Ctrl-Shift-F or Command-Shift-F on the Mac to bring up the fade dialog box, change the opacity to 50%, and press the Enter or Return key in order to apply that change. I'll also go ahead and zoom in so I can better see what I'm doing. There's that little area of brightness right there that I'd like to calm down, so I'll click on it. That looks pretty good. And then I'll increase the size of my brush and click right about there on that area that's too bright. And again, I might have gone too far. So I'll press Ctrl-Shift-F, Command-Shift-F on the Mac, and this time I'll just press Shift-Down arrow a few times until I reduce that opacity value to 70%. Click OK in order to accept that change. Let's try clicking right about there with a smaller brush. Again, maybe that's too much, so I'll press Ctrl-Shift-F or Command-Shift-F on the Mac, take the opacity down to 50%, and press the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac in order to make that change. All right, let's go wide again, just so I can see what I'm doing from a decent vantage point. There's a couple of regions that remain a little bit too bright, in my opinion, so I'll increase the size of my cursor slightly and drag up like that in order to continue that shadow from the nose over a little. And again, that looks like I might have gone too far. This is the way things work when you're brushing with these tools. So I'll press Ctrl-Shift-F, Command-Shift-F on the Mac, reduce the opacity to 50%, press the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac, and then maybe brush up into this region. Definitely went too far that time. So press Ctrl-Shift-F or Command-Shift-F on the Mac. Let's try 30% and see if that works. That looks actually pretty good. Then I'll click OK in order to accept that change. You can reverse the effect a little by using the opposite tool. So I'm feeling like that area is a little bit too dark. So I'll switch from the burn tool back to the dodge tool, and I'll just give it a click right at that location. And that brightens things up in a way I like. So technically it's a destructive modification to work back and forth that way, but you have to be realistic as well. So going back and forth a little bit doesn't hurt. And now I'd like to reintroduce some texture in this area. So I'll switch over to my standard healing brush tool, and I'll Alt click or Option click in the left-hand cheek in order to lift some of that porous detail. And this time I'm going to switch the mode from normal to screen so that I brighten up the details because I don't really want to introduce too much darkness. And I'll click right about there with a fairly large brush in order to add some texture. And so this was before that click and this is after. So in addition to adding a little bit of texture below the eye, I also went ahead and changed out the texture a little bit, as you can see. So this is before and this is after, but it ultimately makes for a more even transition. And that's at least one way to employ the dodge and burn tools very judiciously here inside Photoshop.